The hotel was a sight to behold, a true masterpiece of Art Deco architecture perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the stormy sea. Its intricate design and elegant lobby were a testament to the glamour and sophistication of the early 1920s. The lobby's high ceilings and marble floors added to the grandeur of the place, and the plush furnishings and crystal chandeliers added a touch of luxury. But the true gem of the hotel was its interior. The lounge area was decorated in rich green and gold, with plush velvet chairs and a grand fireplace that provided warmth and comfort. The dining area was equally stunning, with a beautifully crafted bar stocked with the finest spirits and crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. Each guest room was unique, designed with the utmost comfort and luxury in mind. The fluffy duvets and intricately designed wallpaper added an elegant touch to the already charming rooms. Despite its grandeur, the hotel's charm wasn't limited to its interior. The hotel was the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life, surrounded by the calming beauty of the English countryside. It was no surprise that it had quickly become a favorite among travelers. Although it was early spring, the stormy weather had turned unexpectedly cold and fierce, the wind howling through the seagrass and the sea thrashing violently against the shore. The waves grew bigger and more ferocious, crashing against the shore with an ear-splitting roar that could be heard even from the hotel. The boats on the water were tossed about like leaves in a hurricane, struggling to stay afloat amidst the churning waves. The once busy harbor was now deserted, with many of the boats forced to dock due to the harsh weather. The guests were confined indoors, but the stormy weather had a captivating quality that kept them glued to the windows. The sea was a magnificent shade of deep blue, and the white-capped waves seemed to stretch on endlessly. The rain fell relentlessly, each drop adding to the frenzied dance that played out on the windows of the hotel. Despite the weather, the hotel's interior was warm and inviting, with a roaring fire in the hearth and soft lighting casting a warm glow over the elegant furnishings. In the lounge, a group of guests huddled around the fire, sipping on hot tea and chatting in low voices. There were 5 guests in total, each with their unique backgrounds and personalities. There was Lady Penelope, a wealthy widow from London, elegant and refined in her demeanor. Then there was Captain William, a retired naval officer from Plymouth, with a sharp wit and a love for adventure. The third guest was Mr. Edward, a successful businessman from Manchester, quiet and reserved, but with an observant eye for detail. The fourth guest was Miss Amelia, a young artist from Paris, with a creative spirit and a keen eye for beauty. Finally, there was Mr. Thomas, a middle-aged banker from Birmingham, reserved and conservative in his mannerisms. Despite their differences, the guests had formed a bond over the course of their stay, brought together by the mysterious events that had transpired during their time at the hotel. As the storm raged on outside, the guests continued to share stories and enjoy each other's company. But little did they know, the storm was only the beginning of a series of mysterious events that would unfold during their stay at the hotel. As the night wore on, the storm grew fiercer, the wind and rain lashing against the windows with increasing force. The guests retired to their rooms, seeking refuge from the tumultuous weather. But as they settled into their beds, they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Lady Penelope was the first to notice it. She had just settled into her bed, snuggled under the warm duvet, when she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the wall. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but as the sound grew louder, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She got out of bed and approached the wall, pressing her ear against it. The scratching was unmistakable now, coming from the other side of the wall. She knocked on the wall, but there was no response. Lady Penelope felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Meanwhile, in another room, Captain William was awoken by a strange sound. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside his door. He got out of bed and approached the door, pressing his ear against it. The footsteps grew louder, and he could hear faint whispers as well. It sounded like two people were talking, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Captain William opened the door and peered out into the hallway, but there was no one there. The footsteps had stopped, and the whispers had faded away. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, and went back to bed. In another room, Mr. Edward was awakened by a loud thumping sound coming from the ceiling. It sounded like someone was walking on the floor above him, but he knew that there were no rooms on the floor above his. The thumping grew louder and more frenzied, and he could hear a faint humming sound as well. It sounded like someone was singing, but the tune was unfamiliar to him. He got out of bed and approached the door, intending to go up to the floor above and investigate. But as he opened the door, the thumping stopped, and the humming faded away. Mr. Edward felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Something was definitely not right. In yet another room, Miss Amelia was awakened by a sudden gust of wind, blowing the curtains in her room wide open. She got out of bed and approached the window, intending to close the curtains, but as she looked out into the stormy night, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There was a figure standing on the cliff outside her window, shrouded in a cloak, its face hidden in the shadows. Miss Amelia couldn't make out any features, but the figure seemed to be staring right at her. She gasped and stumbled backward, her heart racing. The guests were all experiencing strange and unsettling events, but they were too afraid to share their experiences with each other, afraid that they would be dismissed as imagining things. But as the morning dawned, they knew that something was definitely not right. The night was long and restless for the guests at the hotel. Each had been awakened by strange sounds that seemed to come from the walls, the ceiling, or the hallway outside their room. Despite their attempts to dismiss these sounds as nothing more than their imaginations, they couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that something was amiss. The next morning, as the storm continued on its rampage, the guests gathered in the dining area for breakfast, chatting about the events of the night before. Lady Penelope spoke of the scratching sound she had heard, while Captain William recounted the footsteps and whispers he had heard outside his door. Mr. Edward shared his experience of the thumping and humming sound, and Miss Amelia spoke of the sudden gust of wind that had awakened her. Mr. Thomas, who had slept soundly throughout the night, listened intently to their stories, trying to make sense of what was happening. As they finished their breakfast, the hotel manager, a tall and imposing man named Mr. Johnson, approached their table. "Good morning, guests," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "I hope you all had a good night's rest, despite the storm." The guests greeted him warmly, but Lady Penelope couldn't help but ask, "Mr. Johnson, have there been any reports of strange sounds or sightings in the hotel before?" Mr. Johnson's expression grew serious. "I'm afraid not, Lady Penelope. We have never had any reports of unusual activity in the hotel before." The guests exchanged worried glances. If the hotel had no history of strange occurrences, then what could be causing the sounds they had heard the night before? As they were leaving the dining area, Mr. Johnson approached Lady Penelope. "If I may, Lady Penelope," he said, "there is something I must show you." Curious, Lady Penelope followed Mr. Johnson to a small room near the lobby. The room was bare except for a wooden chest sitting in the center. Mr. Johnson opened the chest, revealing an old leather-bound book. "This is the hotel's guest book," he said, handing it to Lady Penelope. "It contains the names and signatures of all our guests since we opened in 1921. Lady Penelope flipped through the pages, her eyes widening in surprise as she came across a familiar name. "But this can't be right," she said, pointing to a signature at the bottom of a page. "This is my name, but I've never stayed at this hotel before." Mr. Johnson's expression grew grave. "That is because the signature is from 1924, Lady Penelope. The same year that the hotel's original owner, Mr. Charles Bingham, disappeared without a trace." Lady Penelope felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked at the signature again. "Do you think Mr. Bingham's disappearance could be connected to the sounds we heard last night?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Johnson hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm not sure, Lady Penelope. But there have been rumors and stories about strange happenings in this hotel since Mr. Bingham's disappearance. Some say his ghost haunts the halls, searching for something he lost. The guests had gathered around Lady Penelope and Mr. Johnson, listening intently to their conversation. Miss Amelia spoke up. But what could he have lost that he still searches for after all these years? Mr. Johnson looked at them gravely. No one knows for sure, but some say it's a valuable possession or a secret that could ruin the hotel's reputation. It's said that whoever finds what Mr. Bingham lost will be richly rewarded. Captain William, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. Well, we certainly heard some strange sounds last night. Maybe it's time we try to find out what's going on. The group looked at each other, uncertain of what they were getting themselves into, but the mystery was too tempting to ignore. They decided to split up and search the hotel for any clues that might lead them to what Mr. Bingham lost. Lady Penelope and Miss Amelia took the upper floors, while Mr. Edward and Captain William searched the lower floors. Mr. Thomas, who was still recovering from his illness, stayed behind with Mr. Johnson. As they searched the hotel, the guests couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The storm outside had grown worse, and the hotel was now creaking and groaning under its force. But they pressed on, determined to solve the mystery. It was Captain William who made the discovery. As he was searching one of the hotel's storage rooms, he stumbled upon a locked chest. Using his skills as a former sailor, he managed to pick the lock and open the chest. Inside, he found a pile of papers and letters, all addressed to Mr. Bingham. But what caught his eye was a small, leather-bound journal. As he opened it, he couldn't believe what he was reading. The journal contained a detailed account of Mr. Bingham's last days in the hotel before his disappearance. He wrote of a valuable possession he had hidden somewhere in the hotel and of his fear that someone was trying to steal it from him. He also wrote of a secret he had uncovered, something that could destroy the hotel's reputation if it ever got out. Captain William knew he had found what Mr. Bingham had lost, but now the question was, who else knew about it, and who was willing to do anything to get their hands on it? Captain William quickly gathered the other guests and showed them the journal he had found. They all read through the entries, their eyes widening in shock at what they were learning. It seems that Mr. Bingham was onto something big, Lady Penelope said, her voice low with concern. But if someone else is after it, we could be in danger. The group was silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Suddenly they heard a loud crash from the floor above them, followed by a series of thumps and bumps. It was coming from Mr. Thomas's room. They rushed up the stairs, fear coursing through their veins. As they reached Mr. Thomas's door, they found it locked from the inside. "Mr. Thomas!" Lady Penelope shouted, banging on the door. "Are you okay?" There was no answer, only the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Captain William took out his pocket knife and began picking the lock. As soon as the door was open, they rushed inside, only to find Mr. Thomas lying on the ground, unconscious. The room was in disarray, with furniture overturned and papers scattered everywhere. Suddenly, they heard a loud noise from the hallway outside. It sounded like someone was running away. The group rushed out of the room, following the sound. As they reached the end of the hallway, they saw a figure disappearing down the stairs. Captain William and Mr. Edward gave chase, but the figure was too fast for them. When they reached the lobby, they found the front door wide open and the figure nowhere to be seen. They quickly searched the area, but there was no sign of anyone. It seemed that whoever it was had vanished into thin air. The group returned to Mr. Thomas's room, where Lady Penelope tended to his injuries. It was clear that someone had broken into his room, searching for something. But what were they looking for, and why? As the storm outside finally began to die down, the group realized that they were in far deeper than they had ever imagined. They had stumbled upon a mystery that was far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The group gathered together in the hotel's sitting room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Lady Penelope poured them all cups of tea, and they settled in, ready to discuss their next steps. "We need to figure out what this person was after," Mr. Edward said, taking a sip of his tea. It's clear they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it. But where do we start? Miss Amelia asked, wringing her hands nervously. We don't even know what we're looking for. Captain William leaned forward in his chair. We have the journal, he said. Perhaps there's a clue in there that can help us. The group nodded in agreement, and Lady Penelope retrieved the journal from her bag. They began to read through it once again, searching for any information that might be helpful. As they read, they noticed that there were several entries written in code. Lady Penelope, who was fluent in several languages, studied the code carefully. I believe this is a simple substitution cipher, she said, pointing to one of the entries. If we can decode it, we might be able to figure out what Mr. Bingham was working on. The group worked together to decode the entries, slowly piecing together the puzzle. It seemed that Mr. Bingham had been researching a powerful artifact, one that was rumored to grant its owner immortality. As they read further, they realized that Mr. Bingham had been close to finding the artifact when he disappeared. It seemed that someone had taken him, perhaps to prevent him from finding it. We need to find this artifact before they do, Captain William said, his jaw set in determination. But how do we even begin? Miss Amelia asked, looking around the room in despair. There was a moment of silence as they all considered their options. Suddenly, Mr. Edwards spoke up. I may know someone who can help, he said, his eyes shining with excitement. A colleague of mine who specializes in ancient artifacts. He might be able to help us find what we're looking for. The group nodded in agreement. It was their best shot at solving the mystery and uncovering the truth behind Mr. Bingham's disappearance. They quickly made arrangements to contact Mr. Edwards' colleague, and as they settled in for the night, they knew that the next few days would be filled with danger and adventure. The next morning, the group set out to meet Mr. Edwards' colleague, Dr. Marcus Goldstein, at his private estate on the outskirts of town. They were greeted by the sight of a large, imposing mansion surrounded by lush gardens and towering trees. Dr. Goldstein, a tall, thin man with a bushy mustache, greeted them warmly and invited them inside. As they settled into the sitting room, he listened intently as they recounted their experiences at the hotel. It seems that Mr. Bingham was searching for an artifact of great power, Lady Penelope explained. We believe that whoever is after it may have been responsible for his disappearance. Dr. Goldstein stroked his mustache thoughtfully. I see, he said. Well, I may be able to help you. I have contacts all over the world who specialize in rare and valuable artifacts. If anyone knows anything about this artifact, they will. The group breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed that they were one step closer to uncovering the truth. Over the next few days, Dr. Goldstein made several calls to his contacts, gathering information about the artifact and its whereabouts. They learned that the artifact was a small, ancient statue made of solid gold and encrusted with precious gems. It's a powerful relic, Dr. Goldstein warned them. Whoever possesses it would have immense power and influence. Be careful. The group set out to follow the leads that Dr. Goldstein had given them, traveling across the country in search of the statue. They encountered many obstacles along the way, from dangerous cults to treacherous terrain, but they never gave up. Finally, after weeks of searching, they found themselves standing in front of a crumbling temple in the middle of the jungle. The temple was overgrown with vines and moss, and the entrance was guarded by a group of armed men. We have to get inside, Captain William said, his voice firm. The statue must be in there. The group formulated a plan, sneaking past the guards and making their way inside the temple. They encountered many traps and obstacles, but they managed to overcome them all. Finally, they reached the inner chamber of the temple, where the statue was held. It glowed softly in the dim light, its precious stones sparkling like stars. As they reached for the statue, they heard a low growl. Turning around, they saw a large, menacing figure standing in the shadows. "Who dares to disturb my temple?" the figure bellowed. The group tensed, ready for a fight. But then, to their surprise, the figure stepped forward into the light. It was Mr. Charles Bingham. "Thank goodness!" Lady Penelope exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace him. "We've been searching for you for weeks." Mr. Bingham smiled wearily. "I've been searching for this statue for years," he said. "It has the power to grant immortality, you know. But now that I see the danger it poses, I think it's time to destroy it." The group nodded in agreement, and they quickly made arrangements to transport the statue to a secure location where it could be safely destroyed. As they made their way back to civilization, they knew that they had uncovered the truth behind Mr. Bingham's disappearance and stopped a dangerous artifact from falling into the wrong hands. They were heroes, and they knew that their adventure would be remembered for years to come. As the group returned to their respective homes, they couldn't shake the feeling that their adventures were far from over. They had uncovered the truth behind Mr. Bingham's disappearance and prevented the dangerous statue from falling into the wrong hands, but they couldn't help but feel an inexplicable sense of unease. Their senses were soon piqued when they each received a mysterious letter in the mail, inviting each of them to join an expedition to Egypt. The letter was signed simply with the initials EM and included no other information. At first, they were all hesitant to accept, wary of the strange events that had already begun to occur. Lady Penelope had received an ornate scarab beetle brooch in the mail, with no note or explanation. Captain William had received a package with an ancient map of Egypt, which seemed to lead to a secret location. Dr. Goldstein had heard whispers of an ancient artifact that had recently surfaced in Egypt, and he couldn't resist the lure of its potential knowledge. And Mr. Edward had received a cryptic message from a colleague, claiming that he had uncovered something incredible in Egypt and that he needed his help. Despite their reservations, some of them found themselves drawn to the invitation, compelled by an unknown force that seemed to be guiding them. But others decided not to test fate twice and ignored the invitation. And so a group of travelers met once again in Egypt, ready for their new adventure. As the group of travelers arrived in Egypt, they were filled with a sense of excitement and trepidation. Captain William, Lady Penelope, Dr. Goldstein, and Mr. Edward had each received mysterious letters inviting them to Egypt, but none of them knew who had sent them or why. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by a tall figure dressed in ancient Egyptian garb. He introduced himself as Anubis and claimed to have been sent to guide them on their journey. The group was taken aback by Anubis's appearance. There was something different about him. He seemed majestic and almost otherworldly, as if he had stepped straight out of an ancient tomb. Despite their reservations, they followed Anubis deep into the desert, where they felt the sand shift and whisper beneath their feet. As they journeyed further and further from civilization, strange things began to happen. Whispers on the wind seemed to carry secrets from the ages past, and shadows moved in the corners of their eyes, beckoning them to uncover what was hidden in the sands. A strange energy coursed through their bodies, filling them with anticipation and a sense of foreboding. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were in another place, another time. As they walked, the sky grew dark, and the air thick with the scents of sand, spice, and incense. They followed Anubis, and eventually came upon a magnificent palace nestled in the middle of the desert. The palace was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was adorned with intricate hieroglyphs and vibrant colors, all illuminated by torches flickering in the night. The group looked around, bewildered, and wondered where they were and what was happening. They all looked amazed and confused. As they approached the palace, they noticed a procession of men walking out of the palace towards them. The men were dressed in dazzling white Egyptian garb, with headdresses and jewelry so intricate they sparkled in the torchlight. As the procession of men approached the bewildered travelers, they could feel a sense of awe wash over them as they took in the sight before them. Their eyes were drawn to the men's darkly lined eyes that seemed to glisten in the flickering torchlight. The leader of the procession, a tall and imposing figure, approached the travelers with a regal bearing. He looked at each of them in turn with an intense gaze that seemed to penetrate their very souls. He then spoke in a deep, booming voice that echoed through the night air. "Travelers," the leader said, I am Amun-Ra, High Priest of the Palace of the Pharaohs. You have been brought here for a purpose that will soon become clear to you." The group looked around anxiously for Anubis, but he was nowhere to be found. They looked at each other in confusion, wondering what could be the purpose of their sudden journey to this ancient palace in the middle of the desert. Lady Penelope felt panicked, but she tried to remain calm and composed. With that, the procession turned and began to walk back towards the palace. The group hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but the energy of the desert seemed to be pulling them towards the palace. Amun-Ra motioned for the travelers to follow him, so they took a deep breath and followed the men into the palace. They walked through the palace's grand entrance, which was adorned with brightly colored paintings of hieroglyphs. The palace's interior was as awe-inspiring as its exterior, with massive columns towering overhead and intricate mosaics covering the walls and floors. As they walked, the travelers could smell the sweet fragrance of burning incense, which seemed to permeate every corner of the palace. The smell was both alluring and mysterious, adding to the feeling that they had entered another world entirely. The group followed Amun-Ra deeper into the palace, unsure of what was to come next. Their minds raced with questions about who had brought them here and what secrets lay hidden within the walls of this ancient palace. They knew that they had been brought here for a reason, but what that reason was, they could only guess. Their journey had just begun, and each step brought them closer to the truth. Who was Anubis really? Who sent the mysterious letters and why? What secrets would they uncover in the depths of the palace? Only time would tell.